What y'all listening to?
Limelight Highlight Podcast.
Welcome back to the show, your positive podcast, safe space, and great place for a positive outlook on life. As always, I am your host, Jonathan Rosario, J. Rose, John Rio, however you want to call me. So I unfortunately didn't get to have a podcast last week because of some family stuff going on. I'm going to be a little vulnerable right here in this intro right now. My grandmother is on her way out the door, pretty much. The door we call life. She made a decision to be comfortable at home with our family, and I had to go back home to visit her to say my final goodbyes. She was on dialysis for a little while, and basically the dialysis hasn't been working. She couldn't get a transplant, or she didn't want a transplant for her kidneys. So she was given a choice to either continue dialysis with little or no progress, or be home with her loved ones to be comfortable until it's her time to say goodbye. And she chose the latter. She was actually in pretty high spirits for the situation. So I was just grateful that I was able to go back home and see her and spend some time with her while she was still here. It's really weird saying goodbye to somebody that is still around. Is still around, and you knowing there is a very high chance of not seeing them again. But don't want to be daunting. Don't mean to be daunting. Just wanted to share that she got into that position because she drank a lot. She was an alcoholic because of a lot of life's circumstances. One being my uncle, when I was in 4th grade, her firstborn died of an overdose on heroin. If you live in Philadelphia, you know that there's a huge problem with drugs there, and he succumbed to that, and she needed an outlet, and she chose drinking. So the reason I'm sharing all this is because this podcast is our guest. We're going to have a guest today. As you can see that the time duration of this podcast is a little longer than the usual. But today's guest, her name is Gill. Gill. She spells it Gill. I have a friend named Gill. But she's a biochemist who lives in Boston. She recently launched a podcast called Sober Powered, where she discusses addiction, science, and psychology, and her experiences getting sober. She's 8 months sober, and she also has her own blog where she contributes to other websites. The blog is also called Sober Powered, and she so graciously agreed to be a guest on this podcast, and we dive a little bit into how addiction and alcohol affect the mind, the body, the chemistry, receptors in your brain, all of those things, and some of her experiences on why she chose to be sober and what got her to that point in her life. It was very enlightening. I really enjoyed this podcast. I really enjoyed talking to her. I got a lot of gems and knowledge out of this. I hope you do as well. And if you can relate in any way, shape, or form, whether it's a loved one you know, try to get them help, get in contact with Gill. She's very knowledgeable in this area, and seems like she's got a pretty good hold on everything. So once again, if you like the podcast, like, subscribe, and check hers out as well. I'll have all those links in the show notes. So without further ado, Gill, enjoy. We got Gill on the podcast, and Gill has a bachelor's in chemistry and a master's in biology, and you're a biochemist that lives in Boston right now.
Yes.
So you have your own podcast called the Sober Powered Podcast, and you talk about your experiences with alcohol, and you get into the science of these things. So with your extensive knowledge, I think it's safe to say that you know what you're talking about, huh?
I hope so. I mean, I'm putting it out there like I do. So
I wanted to get you on the podcast because so last week I know we scheduled something for last week to get you on. Unfortunately, I had a family emergency. It actually has a lot to do with this episode of what we're going to talk about today. So my grandmother, she was a really big alcoholic growing up, when that I remember growing up, and she basically drank her organs to death. And
Gosh.
yeah, so she's been on dialysis for the last close to 10 years.
Wow. I'm so
And
sorry.
yeah, that's all right. And so her being on dialysis, after a while, it doesn't work. For people
Yeah.
who don't know, your kidneys are basically the filters of your body, and if they're not going to filter anything, you only got so long to live. And we got the news last week that the doctors were telling us, you know, it's coming to an end. Basically, they can either continue to do the dialysis and with little or no progress, or she can go home and get comfortable. So she made the decision to go home and get comfortable. She was sick of dialysis anyway, but right now she's still alive. But we're just waiting for that dreaded phone call
Yeah.
and that day where you know no more. But I wanted to talk to you because once again, with your biology and chemistry degrees, kind of just talk a little more about addiction and alcoholism, and maybe share your story for some of the listeners on my podcast who haven't gotten to yours.
Yeah. That sounds great.
So I think the first question I would have, or I know talking to a couple of my friends or people that I've talked to over the years, you always hear addiction is a choice, not a disease. And I wanted to get your opinion on what addiction is.
I'm so happy that you just asked that question. No one has ever asked me that before, but I have been judged that it was a choice. People have said things like, why did you have to drink so much? Why couldn't you just drink less? Um, and that, I don't know, that just like really surprises me when people have that opinion. I think um, obviously not everyone struggles with alcohol, but I think we all have our individual struggles. We have our own like thing that we're not choosing to do in a negative way, but we have trouble controlling it. And for me, that was alcohol. I guess the way that I would explain what it feels like is getting accidentally drunk. I seem to get accidentally drunk pretty frequently for the 7 years that I drank. It's also going into it with a plan. I was very obsessed with moderation for the last 5 years of my drinking, and your plan just never seems to work out, no matter how well thought out it is, or all the controls you try to put in place. You never seem to have two drinks and stop. It's really like as soon as you have the first one, it kind of unlocks something in you that just like won't stop. And that is what I observed from the very first time I started drinking. It wasn't something that developed. It was the way that I drank.
Right. And I know, going back to my grandmother, a big part of the reason she started drinking was because, so I'm from Philadelphia,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if you know, but in Philadelphia, there's a huge drug problem, especially with heroin.
Yeah.
I've lost a few friends to heroin, and I think my grandmother's drinking really started after she lost my uncle, after he
Oh.
overdosed on heroin. And from there, it was the reason I know from, I think, a younger age, I was never really, I didn't have that mindset on addiction being a choice, because nobody chooses to almost ruin their lives because they
Yep.
have no control over their vices, I guess you can call it. So yeah, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, and people, I think another misconception along the same lines is that we love fun, and we're just like seeking out all the fun that we can have all the time and being selfish about it. But when you're drinking switches to a bad place, like your grandmother and like mine, it's not fun. I really don't think your grandmother was having fun when she drank for so long and so much that her organs were shutting down. That kind of drinking, just it's not fun anymore. You're doing it because the idea of not doing it anymore is terrifying. It's like your whole life revolves around the fact that you have a drink. I was a daily drinker, but for some people it's that weekend binge. And the idea of not doing that anymore, you can't even comprehend it. And it's never fun. Like all those times that I accidentally got drunk and humiliated myself and spent the whole night awake shaming myself and the whole next day, that definitely was not fun.
Yeah. Is there is there any brain chemistry going on when you become, I mean, I don't know how it is with alcohol, but I know some people, whatever drug that they decide to try, and they end up kind of, like you said, that thing is unlocks in their brain where they just can't stop. Is there some type of brain chemistry that goes on which basically makes them reliant on that substance? Or
Yeah. So a
yeah.
couple interesting things happen. So before I talk about the brain, neuroscience is not what my degree is in, but it is something I'm really passionate about just because of my experience. So I'm working through learning everything about it. The brain is super complex, so there's a lot of parts to it, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of changes that occur that we have actually been able to visualize. So when someone drinks a lot for a long period of time, what happens is their pleasure centers get kind of hijacked and they change. So I read a study that was very, very interesting, and it was about MRI imaging of alcoholics versus like normal social drinkers. And they presented both groups with a cue, like think about your favorite alcoholic drink. And the alcoholics' brains were completely lit up. Their pleasure centers, there were 3 different areas that were lit up just thinking about their favorite drink. And if you look at the MRI image for the normal drinkers, their brain didn't have any activity. It was just a normal brain. So the areas that are affected, the first one is the nucleus accumbens. It's something that controls our motivation. And then the cingulate, so that converts feelings into action. So that is why cravings are so powerful. If you, maybe I'll use like chocolate as an example. That's something we all struggle with. If you really like, you want a cookie so bad, like you just feel it, and you try, like, no, doing good on my diet, I'm not going to have one. You keep thinking about it and it gets more powerful, and that's like converting your feeling into an action, and eventually you go have the cookie anyways.
Yeah, sugar's really addictive, huh?
Yeah, so sugar is something I'm researching right now, and it's very interesting because a lot of people quit drinking and they go right to sugar, and that's because it makes you feel a very similar high. The high, yeah. So it's similar to cocaine, and it affects the same parts of the brain as cocaine and morphine, and it
Oh
just
wow.
makes you feel really, really good. Um, and since we can't drink alcohol anymore, sugar is so accessible. I mean, I have never like done drugs in my life. I don't, no judgment like for people that have. I just was never interested in that. But I'm not going to go out and try to find some drug to consume. That's very challenging for me. But I
Right.
can, put on my Instacart app, I can get a bunch of sugar and have them just bring it to my house. And it's so easy and it's so accessible and it's okay. And a lot,
And it's in almost everything.
yeah, there's so much sugar everywhere. And the last part that's changed in the brain is called the insula, and that That is what controls our search for food. So like if we're very hungry and we're searching out food,